Well, and there we go again. Holy cow, Bruce. You are the most unprofessional podcaster in the world. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Bruce McDonald, and this is the Talamanca Review. And it's 10:50 p.m. It's Thursday, the 4th of December, and I have a show in mind. This is not a cold start show, but I'll do what I usually do, which is talk about some regular everyday stuff before I get into it. I went to town today, and I went to get my fingerprints done. For part of my residency process, I have to get my fingerprints registered with the police. So I went to two different stations, and neither one was the correct one. I have to make another trip to this town called Limon. So I'm looking forward to that. It's the most dangerous city in Costa Rica, by the way. It's okay. Everything's okay during the daytime, though. There's certain places in this country where you can't walk around at night unless you're known in that area. So in the towns closest to my mountain, which are also extremely dangerous, I can go, and probably be okay for the most part, but I wouldn't push my luck. So, how dangerous are they? Well, think New York around the time of Scorsese's Taxi Driver, 1974 or 76, whenever that came out. And that's what it's like. It's okay, though. It's just, up here in the mountain, everything's good. So, yeah, I did that. I got some passport photos taken, all of this final touches for my residency. And I'm really looking forward to being a resident of Costa Rica and eventually a citizen in, 2 to 5 years, I think. It's 2 years of temporary residence and then 2 years of permanent residence. And then you can apply for your citizenship. That might take a number of years, but once you have your permanent residency, you're pretty good to go, right? But I wouldn't mind having dual citizenship. So I continue my experimentations with AI. Some of you have seen already. I'm particularly fond of the Talamanca Review essays. They just came out really nice, and, even being the podcaster, when I read it in essay format, I find it very, very interesting. I find my own podcast interesting. The transmutation process going to essay is quite fascinating, actually. Quite fascinating indeed. And I get insights, which is amazing because I'm the substance of the essays, right? They're from my transcripts. But it brought to light something that I've always been aware of. And this just sort of escaped me, And that is the profound difference between the spoken word and the written word. And how consciousness interprets and ingests and digests both. When we're listening to something, or listening and observing if it has a picture as well, there's a way we take in the information in which it doesn't register completely. It's interesting, If you think about all the conversations you've had with people, how much do you really retain? And the answer is not that much. we have a process or something going on inside of us in which conversation goes into one part of the brain or consciousness. I don't like to say brain. I don't like the neuroscientific approach to human cognition. I find it insulting and degrading. Kind of cosmic racism, if you will. But when we read something, it stays with us and registers with us in a completely different way. And I think it's because reading unifies the inner and the outer person. So it becomes, in a sense, a kind of meditation. But not really, but that's the only thing I can say to describe it. But because we have to use our internal resources to cognize and in many instances visualize what we're reading. Cognize would be to ingest an idea like consumerism is a social virus. There's no imagery related to that. Well, actually your consciousness may produce imagery. Okay? It may produce imagery. But when you're listening to somebody speak, that internal process isn't really there. You have two apparent senses to engage the conversation, depending on whether or not the conversation is taking place in person or over a telephone, but a telephone with no video. So just a straight up phone call or something like that. Or radio, the difference between radio and television. So when you're taking in a conversation and you're physically present with the person, or I would say video would achieve a significant portion of the physical presence. Your internal faculties are operating in a kind of unconscious state. You're looking at the person, you're listening to the person, and your inner state is in preparation for the moment in which you're going to interject. You're going to respond to what you've been told. When you're reading, that necessity of response is not there. And so the way you take the information in is different, and you use more inner resources. And we generally read in a sense, in a sensory deprivation. Of course, we're using our eyes, which some people would say is the main sense, the sense of sight. But once you get into the flow of reading, the visualization of the words and the letters and the lines and the paragraphs becomes sort of irrelevant. A really good book can sort of capture you. And the capturing takes place within you. And a really well done book, a book of literary fiction, I think The Art of Literature, is in many ways the complete transference of experience. Just think about it for a moment. I'll try to come up with some examples that would make it easy to understand. Let's take a book like Catcher in the Rye. When you read Catcher in the Rye, it's not so much that you get a bunch of information. What you get is the experience of being a 16-year-old boy on the cusp of adulthood, but still in possession of many of the aspects of innocence that are the attendant preoccupation or disposition of being that young. You see, our innocence is taken away from us by experience. Of course, this is completely captured by William Blake in his most famous collection, Songs of Innocence and Experience. And in many ways, the journey that we're on as human beings in this cycle of incarnations is to return to innocence with all knowledge and all experience. That's it in a nutshell. And I mean, the experience is defined as what a human being can experience. It's not specific in the sense that, you would have to go on the roller coaster at Coney Island to fulfill all of the available experience in a life or lives or being human. But the thrill of going on the roller coaster, the thrill of being in a controlled experience that produces the sense of danger and exhilaration would be the experience that would have to be completed in the gamut of human experiences through the incarnation cycle. And so, in a sense, what we're doing is returning to innocence. We're returning to where we began, but with all knowledge and all experience. Not retained in our memory banks, but experienced. So a really well done book is The Transference of Experience. So you may ask yourself, why am I thinking about these things? Well, I've continued on with my experimentation with AI, and I thought I would try to do another book. I'm working on it now. And so I chose the Danny Jones podcast. And I chose all of the interviews he did related to the subject of DMT and ayahuasca, which seems to be a very popular topic on some of the bigger podcasters, and certainly a major topic with Danny Jones. He's got at least a dozen podcasts with neuroscientists and shaman and all kinds of people related to DMT and this alternate dimension or parallel dimension that the users go into. And of course, if you're following this topic at all, the biggest revelation to come out is this researcher, I believe he's out of Montreal, Montreal, Canada. And he was able to discover and replicate, not only for himself, but for other DMT users, an underlying code in reality, strange as it sounds. And a lot of people are talking about this now. And it's done with a laser while you're on DMT, and where the laser hits, you can see code. Now, the principal researcher justifiably so thought that perhaps he was going insane. And so he conducted the same experiment with other people, and they also saw the code. You know, the code is as real as the entities and beings in this DMT dimension. And this is not a huge revelation for me. The specifics of it are interesting, the laser and the code. And when I say code, they say it looks almost exactly like the code in the Matrix. But it's flowing code. And so I downloaded a number of these transcripts, and I've been working with my AI tools to create cogent book chapters. Now, Danny Jones can go quite long in his podcast. He can go over 4 hours sometimes. He's typically around 3 hours, 3:15, 3:30. I don't know who's watching these things, man. I mean, that's a lot of time. And again, I suspect that a lot of people are listening to them in the background while they're doing other things. So a lot of people who work remotely now might be at home working in the way that I work, and coming out of the Bluetooth at a low volume is a podcast. The way some people might work with music or local radio in the background. And so this is another example of how, like, they're not taking everything in. And a lot of extremely significant stuff is coming out in these podcasts. Significance because it's, like I say, it's not startling to me. And it wouldn't be startling to anybody who's been meditating on the regular for 5 years or so. At all. And I know I segue a lot. I can't help it, but it just, things just pop into my head. And it's a perfect opportunity to address them. So this Israeli pseudo-intellectual Yuval Noah Harari, you know, one of his talking points is that, or one of his introductory points when people are speaking to him or doing an interview with him, generally very early on, they address the fact that he allegedly meditates 2 hours a day. An hour in the morning and an hour in the evening. And yet, when you look at his work, like Homo sapien and the various other publications he's produced, there's absolutely no evidence of this multidimensional consciousness. So despite the fact that I've never done DMT, I could sit down with these researchers who self-explore, because like the contemplative life, the DMT life is a self-exploration. But they're starting to come out with a body of what I can only call theology now. It's like a DMT theology. They call it mapping hyperspace, mapping hyperdimensions. And what they're starting to notice is that there is a tremendous similarity in the experiences when people do DMT. And a lot of the entities and beings that they see are consistent, which in and of itself is the beginning of a proof, because you remember the scientific method. For a scientific process or a scientific certainty to be valid, it has to be replicated. And what the DMT people are doing now is they're sharing their notes and they're starting to notice the replication. But the replication does not manifest in the world. It manifests only in the consciousness of the DMT user. But the different users manifest the same results. Now, I find this hopeful, despite the fact that my personal recommendation is not to use these substances. With the exception of extreme trauma and limited alternative options for trauma dissipation as the only criteria for which it would be acceptable, from my opinion. I'm not issuing a papal bull here. I'm just a guy doing a podcast. But I find it hopeful because it's a foreshadowing of what's to come. And what's to come in the immediate future, and the immediate future is the next century and a half, is a multidimensional consciousness with no risk of slipping into superstition. Meaning that the ground will be staked, kind of like putting a flag up at the top of Everest, like Sir Hilary Edmond did. I was here and I can prove it. Whereas in the past, when religions tried to do this, make a multidimensional reality a social reality, because 99.9% of the congregants never experience the mysticism of Francis of Assisi, or Ibn Arabi in the Muslim world, or some of the altered states of consciousness in the highly disciplined and orthodox world of Jewish mysticism, which exists. The Jews are everything. They're everything. They're such a small group of people, but everything in reality, human reality, is in that culture. Everything from atheism to mysticism to the diabolical global plan we see, or I see and expound upon, centered in Jewish supremacy and Noahide law and the Temple of Solomon rebuilt. It's all of those things. There's no the Jews. They're just a remarkable people that have expression in every field, which is unusual. Music, mathematics, literature, mysticism. It's a world inside the world, the Jewish world. Now, the DMT priests, and let's get comfortable using that word because they are priests, they're mapping a cogent multidimensional world. Now, whether you are aware of this or not, the motto of the United States Marine Corps, which is where we go one, we go all, is the spiritual directive of the human race. Where we go one, we go all. But in the examples of the great teachers we've been given, the great spiritual lights who've come to the earth in every culture, by the way, the success rate of achieving that where they went, I will go, is very low. It's at its highest when the individual avatar, Mahatma, or saint, or holy person is alive and has physical contact with the people most likely to experience what they're talking about. Most likely to experience what they're talking about. And that has to do with this notion of agency that I speak about often on the Talamanca Review. It is my thesis that everything that happens on this planet happens through human beings. So, for example, to use an example we're all comfortable with on this podcast, we know that negative entities exist, invisible to our eyes and our senses, because from time to time they express themselves through human beings. Now, part of the cover-up of the 20th century is mental health, which, in my opinion, is more often an energetic disturbance in the life field or the consciousness field of the living person. I don't want to always go back to the common language of Christianity or even the Muslims with the jinn. But anybody who does their due diligence with an open mind will probably come to the conclusion that an invisible, individuated being or entity can greatly influence the consciousness of a living human being, and through that living human being, by the agency of that incarnation, forfeited by the weakness of the inner person in the body, that negative entity can wreak havoc in the world through that body. It's interesting to take a moment to note how fascinated the West is with the idea of a multidimensional reality, or our physical sense-mind reality overlapping and meshing itself in with invisible realities where other individuated sentient beings exist. Something comparable to a human being. And in some instances, or in many instances, the disturbance to the life field or the consciousness field of the living individual may in fact be another human being outside of body. Again, another thing I've discussed at length on the Talamanca Review. Now, the interesting thing about the DMT studies is that they're beginning to catalog these experiences. Now, another idea that I've expressed on the Talamanca Review is that if you really want to grow in a life, a hard life is better than a soft life. An uncomfortable life is better than a comfortable life. And the reason is that these negative states can be used as a fuel to operate at a much higher momentum frequency than a window shopper. A window shopper is somebody who bounces around looking at ideas of consciousness, studying various other people, but never really committing to their own journey. The spiritual life is kind of an object sociological experiment, looking at and interacting with other people who have practice. That, I would say, defines a large part of the New Age community and the experimental consciousness community. So as we begin to map out these multidimensional realities, it's a positive thing for me because it allows me to speak more freely. Because truth be told, I still, and I think most people do, who come to some form of consciousness, I still harbor a little fear and a little trepidation about speaking from my true experienced self. Because my experiences are absolute and certain to me, triple underlined. I attribute this to a lifetime of spiritual practice. As a layman, validating that growth in consciousness and direct experience with multidimensional reality and direct mystical experience is possible for a normal person. You don't have to go to Dar es Salaam and live with the Dalai Lama. You don't have to go live in a monastery. It can happen anywhere to anyone if they're sincere and they keep at it. Sincerity and persistence are the keys. Now, as we begin to explore this multidimensional reality, the concept of earned and unearned experience comes back into focus, as does the concept or the idea of comfort versus discomfort. There's no sacrifice made smoking DMT. There's no sacrifice made drinking ayahuasca. You don't have to invest anything. It's like the consciousness version of plastic surgery. The person who wants to look good but doesn't have the discipline to go to the gym, so they go for the liposuction. Right? Or the person who wants to get really big but doesn't do it naturally, they use steroids. All of these cheats have consequences. And because we live in such a fundamentally negative time right now, although I find great peace and joy in it, I'm not saturated with negativity. But I think from a realistic standpoint, it's a negative time. You know, the threat of annihilation is in the air. I just happened to see a short clip flip through on my YouTube today, and a recent one, I think he just recorded it a few days ago. My neighbor Shinyamurti, he's just openly saying now that, this world is going to end soon. He's really become the voice of doom. And I don't think he's right. I just don't think he's right. And I think it's extremely negative of him to be using that in building out his ashram. That's just my opinion. Just my opinion. I'm just one guy talking. Everything I say is just my opinion. But I don't think it can be beneficial to tell people the world is ending and to tell people that you're a self-realized individual and accentuate the authority of your voice. No, he would probably say he's doing it for motivational purposes. He's mixing the negative and the positive to create an uncomfortable state of mind for people to double down on their spiritual efforts and their meditation to achieve the true self. And if that's the alchemy he's working with, then I don't begrudge him that much, because the means justifies the end if he has a high success rate. If he doesn't, and people just get morbidly depressed and go off and start shooting heroin or something because of what he's saying, then that's very bad, obviously. So because there's no real sacrifice in doing DMT, and because DMT, which is, I guess, the active ingredient in ayahuasca as well, The difference being that smoking DMT, it lasts a very short time, 15 minutes or less, maybe 5 minutes. Whereas ayahuasca can last a number of hours. And it's a much more physically violent experience. You may vomit and excrete diarrhea in the purging phase after you drink the ayahuasca. But how do I word this? If it's not earned, it's not real. And I don't know what it is yet, but there is a consequence to using these plants. Especially these people that Danny Jones is interviewing. There's one fellow who smoked DMT every day, most of the day, for a couple of years. He's lucky to retain his sanity, right? He's the guy who discovered the lasers. Now, I believe that this is a negative agenda. I believe that this is a bait line laid out by the negative principalities and their agents and subordinates. Notice how I avoided any religiously specific language there, like Satan and his demons, because I'll get to that in a minute. As I've said before, if you're entirely skeptical about the whole idea of a multidimensional existence, it may be beneficial to do a potent plant medicine once, but after you know, then you have an almost moral obligation to follow through with spiritual practice, with prayer and meditation and fasting and the various accoutrements that the great teachers have left with us as the recipe for purification and the upliftment of consciousness to higher realms. And being typical North Americans, what we do, and the people who go down this path, is the plant medicine becomes the habitual ritual. Okay? Now mark my words. This is going to have consequences. This is going to have consequences. I don't know what they will be. I rest on my understanding of universal cosmic moral law, somewhat understood a somewhat experienced understanding of cosmic moral law, seeing it operate. And it becomes very easy for me to predict the outcome of this. Okay? Now, another thing to consider is that each of these plants has its own frequency. Each of these plants is a hyperdimensional destination. They're bus tickets. If you get on a bus in Grand Central Station or the bus station in New York City, and you buy a ticket for Atlanta, Georgia, you're going to end up in Atlanta, Georgia, because you bought the Atlanta, Georgia ticket. DMT is a ticket. Okay? And that dimension they're going to the entities and beings there at some point are going to react to a higher volume of traffic, because it's almost like our reaction in the West to large, big numbered annual immigration statistics with no plan by our central authorities, our governments, to accommodate these new immigrants, which is fine. I'm not against immigration. But to harmonize them into the societies they're being brought into. And this goes to the idea of spaces, realms, principalities, cultures, all of these sorts of things. Now, I would take a page out of the book of the rabbis. And the rabbis have realized, and they are encouraging all Jews to make aliyah now. Unless those diaspora Jews are serving a more important function where they are that benefits Israel. And then when the risk becomes too great, when measured against the benefit that they provide, being an American Jew, a French Jew, a British Jew, a Canadian Jew, then they'll be called back, or they'll be going back. And so what they're doing is they're consolidating the energy field of their culture. And mark my words, another prediction on the Talamanca Review. And remember what I said in the podcast a few days ago, it's not hard to predict the future. You just look at the energy and the patterns. What's going to happen next in Israel is there's going to be a tremendous pressure put on the secular and atheist Jews to stop their nonsense and begin participating in full earnest in the observance of the rituals and rites of Judaism. Observe Shabbat, the day of rest, observe the fasting, observe the prayers, observe the morning rituals. Secular Jews are going to become more and more shamed. This gay street party that is Tel Aviv will be crushed. This is what's coming. Okay? This is why I say it's not the Jews, because the Jews living in Israel are going to feel the full effect of these rabbinical circles in charge of that situation now, who have the ear of Netanyahu and who have convinced him that he is the prime minister that's going to bring the Messiah in. As Schneerson, the last great Rebbe of Chabad Lubavitch, told him directly to his face. I'm not saying these things in a positive or negative way, in an anti-Semitic or pro-Semitic way. I'm just telling you. So, what these DMT psychonauts are documenting now is stage one of the experienced consciousness journey. And let me say some positive things. These experiences are real. The entities they're interacting with are real. The places they're going are real. And the fact that they're speaking about it is beneficial to the whole society, because they're giving a version of what the mystics have told us. which is that this physical realm is one of many dimensions. Buddha goes out of his way to document all of these different realms he saw in his meditations. It's interesting to note that both Buddha and Dante Alighieri documented 9 levels to hell. I find, how could that possibly be a coincidence? Right? It's kind of like the DMT thing, except when you get into the footprint of the mystics, it doesn't hit people the right way now because of all the conditioning of the 20th century, which was to break the human being that lives in a state of physical reality and imaginative reality. This is what living in your mythology is. And what happened in the 20th century, with all of the hard sciences, with psychiatry, with pharmacology and chemical support for the ideas or theses of psychiatry, which are largely bogus, by the way. I hope you do understand that. They're largely bogus. And the forces and principalities invisible to our eyes behind these large pharmacology companies like AstraZeneca, like Moderna, like Pfizer, like Glaxo Wellcome, they're not good. They're aligned with the negative principality, its agents, and its subordinates. They're degrading humanity. Okay? But what psychiatry did was it made us all believe we had to live in this reality that science was telling us is real, at risk of possibly being diagnosed as insane if we do not. And so people of mystical experience, you don't have to be fully realized. Robert Monroe was not a fully realized human being. Nowhere near it. Nowhere near it. But he was very well traveled in the astral. The remote viewing, the Super Soldier program, the MK Ultra program, the time travel programs in the government and the secret societies, these are all other dimensions of the ayahuasca reality, the DMT reality. More tangible than religious faith because they're experienced consistently by multiple people. But this consciousness science has not broken into the mainstream yet because it can't be replicated in this physical reality. You have to go and sit in their Montauk chair or go through their experimentation or take the DMT and go and experience yourself, and that experience takes place in another dimension disconnected from or not expressive in this reality, and so you can't prove it to anybody who doesn't go and do what you did. But it's a start, which is why I'm taking it positively. It's a start. This gentleman who saw the code in the DMT with the laser, it's a start. And the human race has to have this discussion. It's part of breaking out of the chrysalis of Abrahamic theology, breaking out of the restraints of Abrahamic theology, breaking out of the limitations of Abrahamic theology, and hopefully retaining the best of it, because remember, the formula is always a mix of truth and falsehood. And the truths in the Abrahamic system are worth preserving. Most specifically, the morality that the Jews gave us. And they are the principal proponents of morality, social morality. Give them their due. Right? Now, what happens after this first stage that the DMT people are talking about is your journeys to other dimensions begin to validate themselves in your physical timeline. I call these things tie-offs. A tie-off is profoundly more significant than a synchronicity. It exists in a probability matrix that is completely improbable, and yet it happened. And there's a connection between your inner life and your outer life. This is what attracts a lot of people to psychics. Oh, how could they know what's on and what my mother said to me when I was 5 years old? Well, the Christians might tell you, well, they got it from a demon. And the Christians are just going too far with this. It's like everything we experience with consciousness is demonic if you don't surrender to Christ. And that's not true. And they're going to have their reckoning as well. Stage 1 is beginning to map internal realities. Validating the reality of these internal realities in the larger cosmology of reality is having them tie off in this reality. The medicinal journeys won't do that. They won't do that. You're never going to see the clock elves pop into your reality when you're off DMT and you're walking down the street. Okay? They're not going to give you a winning lottery number. They're not going to do anything that can connect them to this reality because they live in another reality. It's interesting to me, and I find it fascinating. I'm going to title this podcast Consciousness Cartography. I'm Bruce McDonald, and this has been the Talamanca Review.